Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition, and we turn now to poem 637, The Child's Faith is New. Now, I've said to you guys before that Emily seems to always suggest that the new is the new. The N-E-W is the K-N-E-W. That so much of our learning is cyclical, that we go through certain kinds of rhythms or patterns as we come to new information, and then we leave that information to, as what Ken Wilber, the great integralist thinker, calls transcend and include. And here we will see the game being played again for us. Now, this is one of those poems. Several of you guys have said things like, I come to an Emily poem because we're reading them in order of the Johnson edition, and it seems like all the previous poems were leading up to this poem. Some of you as well have said that Emily is able to capture in a few lines an insight that is going to illuminate the way I think about my life, and certainly many of my students have found this poem revelatory in that regards. Now, as we say, the new is the new. Before we move on to this poem, let's go back to poem 185. Do you remember this? We forecasted we would be coming to this poem, by the way, when we did 185. Faith is a fine invention when gentlemen can see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency. Now, this idea of faith in what you can know is going to be central. The epistemological challenge, the first of our big five, and that leads us to our assumptions. Our assumptions that you've been following are stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily's our playlist. I'm hopeful that you work through our set of comments there that talk specifically about our big five. Epistemology, what you can know. Ontology, who we are. Psychology, the study of the individual mind. Sociology, the study of the collective or the group mind. And then finally, the question of theodicy. Why must there be pain and suffering in this world? And that will be a central question of this poem as well. Now, Sewell, the great scholar and biographer, has pointed out this about Emily. Quote, she knows how innocence ends, but for two stanzas of this poem, she glories in it. How the poem, he finishes, could have come out of a blighted childhood is hard to see, end quote. It is another one of Emily's childhood poems. It is another poem about loss. I'm going to make the argument, and we'll in fact finish with our Milton. I'm going to make the argument that much of Paradise Lost is standing behind her reading of this poem, and of course Genesis 3 and the Genesis 3 account as well. Now, we do have some interesting biographic information. Daniel T. Fisk, great thinker, when was going through the history that Mabel Loomis Todd would made, discovered that Daniel T. Fisk had something to say about Emily as a 12-year-old little girl, a scholar, in fact. And this is what Daniel T. Fisk had to say about Emily. Quote, and this is an important quote because we don't have very many like them. Quote, I have very distinct and pleasant impressions of Emily Dickinson, who was a pupil of mine in Amherst Academy in 1842-43. I remember her as a very bright but rather delicate and frail-looking girl, an excellent scholar, of exemplary deportment, faithful in all school duties, but somewhat shy and nervous. Her compositions were strikingly original, and in both thought and style seemed beyond her years, and always attracted much attention in the school. And I am afraid excited, not a little envy. And again, this is one of the most important portraits that we have of Emily as a young girl. Emily will have said about herself in a letter of 1846 when she was 16 years old, quote, it is my nature always to anticipate more than I realize. Now, this is a poem written when Emily was 30 years old, but she is looking back to understand how one moves from, how would Blake call it, from songs of innocence to songs of experience. She says it this way. The child's faith is new, whole like his principle, wide like the sunrise or fresh eyes, never had a doubt, laughs at a scruple, believes all sham but paradise, credits the world, deems his dominion, broadest of sovereignties, and Caesar mean in the comparison, baseless emperor, ruler of naught, yet swaying all. Grown, by and by, to hold mistaken his pretty estimates of prickly things. He gains the skill, sorrowful as certain, men to anticipate instead of kings. Now there are some who say Emily never wrote a greater poem. By the way, do note the line length here. Do you see that it's shorter? It's going to in some ways remind us of a poem that's coming, 640, I Cannot Live With You. It'll have that very brief kind of staccato. Also notice Emily edits out or cuts out what would be obvious as you read this thing, that it would be the phrase the child, the child, the child as she is speaking. Notice the child, 71 times in her poetry she mentions child or children. The child's faith is new. And again, taking us back to 185. We'll finish here in a bit with poem 915. And again, the idea of new is so important. Now, faith is mentioned in 48 of her poems, but I want to concentrate on this word new. I want to think about it in the form of Eden. I want to think about it in the idea of paradise, and I also want to think about it in the form of, well, to some degree, blind, right? Again, the blind Milton comes to mind, and also protected to some degree. So she'll say it. In other words, you guys start out, everything is new. The world is brand new to the child, and therefore the faith of the child is brand new. It's also whole. Notice, like his principle. In other words, it takes into consideration a whole bunch of things without thinking about them, because when you're young, you don't know what's on the other side of paradise wall, right? Para as in paradisal, over related to protected. We don't know what's on the other side. We immediately, of course, think about our story of the Buddha and how it is that he was raised behind those walls, and when he finally got out, it just blew his mind what he saw. And blowing one's mind is foundational epistemologically to understanding this poem as well. Not only is the knowledge whole, but it's wide. And then, of course, like the sunrise, I can take everything in. There's a certain kind of childlike exuberance. We know everything, right? And, of course, it's all about fresh eyes, right? Like the sunrise on fresh eyes. Again, I think the idea of eyes takes us back to the blind Milton and to Paradise Lost. And now the child never had a doubt. In other words, I know exactly what I'm doing. Laughs at a scruple. It's silly. It's silly to try and figure stuff out. Believes all sham but paradise. And I love this word, believes all. I love this phrase, believes all sham. You can go back to poem 241. And of course, sham is close to the word shame, isn't it? Right? And then of course, her use of the word paradise, I think, locks it in. If we know our Milton, and of course we've given full lectures over all of Paradise Lost at learnstrong.net if you want to run that to ground. If you know your Milton, right, you know it is this idea that fundamentally being in paradise or Eden is one kind of epistemological experience, fundamentally different from being outside, right? Then the child does what else? Well, credits the world, deems his dominion. In other words, I own everything. I know, I run everything, I know everything. Broadest of sovereignties, right? In other words, I rule everything. I am in charge of everything. My opinion is what matters. Your opinion I don't care about at all, right? And then she even mentions Caesar here, takes us back to poem 102. We'll see this reckoning again in 1325, and of course she loves Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. The idea here is that Caesar is mean. That is to say, in comparison to me, the child says, Caesar is average, right? It's like the young ninth grader that walked into 303 and said, I know Shakespeare sucks. And I said, oh, really? So have you read the 36 plays? No, I've never read any of the plays. I just know Shakespeare sucks. And this is what children do. They will take a Caesar and just reduce it down to average. Yeah, Caesar, big deal, right? Notice, in the comparison, right, baseless emperor. In other words, what was Caesar? Ruler of not yet swaying all. In other words, he was an idiot. What does he know? Okay. Now that's the first part of the poem. And then the brilliance of this poem is that we have the word grown, which is of course the key word of the poem. In other words, from a child, we grow up. By and by. Well, remember that phrase from poem 7 and 40 and 246, the only other 3 times she uses this phrase, by and by. In other words, after time. And that's the key. It takes time. You have to meet the serpent in the garden. You have to go through the process of biting, as Milton says, from an apple. Okay? Of course, the Genesis 3 account just calls it fruit. From the apple. Which is why, of course, on the back of so many of your phones, you don't just have an apple. You have a bite out of that apple. Because the bite out of the apple is what grows you. In other words, it takes you from this Eden-like paradisal, can we call it ignorance without insulting you? Ignorance, right? To something by and by. And what is that? Well, you hold mistaken your pretty estimates. Notice the P's here. In other words, all of a sudden you go, oh, dude, I thought it was, it's not this, is it? No, it's not. Of prickly things. Now, this use of the word prickly, I mean, it's fascinating. It only gets used once and only once here. I think of it like the idea of the cactus, right? We live out here, and I can't help but think, of course, of this and the hollow men. Here we go around the prickly pear at 5 o'clock in the morning, as well as, of course, T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. I've said before, I think T.S. Eliot learned a lot from his reading of Emily that he never shared in public. What did he say, though? Good poets borrow, great poets steal. I think he's probably playing that game. But it makes us wonder, what are these prickly things that Emily is talking about? I mean, we've read a whole bunch of poems where she's dealing with some prickly things. Of course, it really fundamentally is what? The question of theodicy. Why must there be pain and suffering in this world? Why? Right? And then all of a sudden, from growing, by and by, now there's the gaining. And it is the key word of the poem, skill. There's what we're looking for as young people who are developing into thinkers, scholars. Notice, but the skill will become sorrowful. Why? Because, what is it? That the Ecclesiastes writes, the gaining of knowledge, there is no end, and then it always seems to lead to certain kinds of sorrow. You'll remember sorrow from 276 and 626. We'll see it again in 1465. When we get to 1506, I think I read this one to you when we did one of those earlier poems. Summer is shorter than anyone, life is shorter than summer. 70 years is spent as quick as only $1. Sorrow now is polite and stays. See how well we spurn him? Equally to abhor delight, equally retain him. Again, here's the question of all questions. The more I know, it seems, the sadder I get in some fundamental way. Because what? Well, the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. And there's just this huge, vast universe of stuff. Oh man, if I don't know this stuff, I probably don't know a lot of other things. Right. That is not the view of a child. That is the view of someone, she calls it grown. And then she uses the word certain as opposed to doubt, as certain men to anticipate instead of kings. In other words, she says kids start out kind of thinking about, right, their life as somehow being everything they know is right, and everyone they meet is a king, right? And then notice we go from Caesars to kings, right, or emperors to kings. And all of a sudden you go, oh, now I have to start thinking differently about the way people are, the way they actually are. When we get to poem 915, we'll play this game again. Faith is the peerless bridge supporting what we see under the scene that we do not, too slender for the eye. It bears the soul as bold as it were rocked in steel with arms of steel at either side. It joins behind the veil. To what could we presume the bridge would cease to be? To our far vacillating feet, a first necessity. Well, what I'm going to say about a message like this at 2A, I think her argument is that the loss of Eden is really hard. And it's that moment when one begins to grow. It's painful, but it's necessary. Sorrowful, to use the language here. At 2B, I love the shortened syntax. It is kind of unusual. And the way in which, again, the words do seem kind of spoken like a child who's just coming to realize, oh, I see, this is what's going on. And of course, it's hard, as we learned in our study of J.D. Salinger's classic short story Teddy, you can't so easily vomit up the apple, right? Once you've bit the knowledge, the apple of knowledge. Well, at 3A, obviously Blake's Songs of Innocence, Songs of Experience, his comparison between lamb and tiger comes to mind. We've given full lectures at learnstrong.net. It is, to me, though, as well reminiscent of Wordsworth's "The child is father of the man." And it almost seems like to be a counter view to this argument. Emily's view here is maybe a little less than romanticized, as we would say it with Wordsworth. Of course, think of Shelley's Frankenstein. What is it Shelley's Frankenstein proves more than anything? Well, it's an epistemological tale. We've given lectures at learnstrong.net. But it's Frankenstein's monster who goes off by itself. And how does it grow? Well, it reads Paradise Lost. And it's in the reading of Paradise Lost that, of course, it comes to those final lines of Paradise Lost. You'll remember it. We've given full lectures on all of Paradise Lost, as we said at learnstrong.net, right? And how do we finish that poem? High In front advanced the brandished sword of God, before them Adam and Eve. Blazed fierce as a comet, which with torrid heat and vapor as the Liberian air adjust, began to parch that temperate clime. Whereat, in either hand, the hastening angel caught our lingering parents. Notice it's lingering, don't want to leave. And to the eastern gate led them direct, and down the cliff as fast to the subjected plain, then disappeared. They, looking back all the eastern side, beheld of paradise. So late their happy seat, waved over by that flaming brand, the gate with dreadful faces thronged and fiery arms. Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They, hand in hand with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way. Now, again, this use of the word way, I think, is brilliant in Milton, and I think she's playing the same game. There is a way we grow up, and this is how we do it. Finally, at 3B, what was a time that you had to leave innocence for experience? I hope Emily's challenging you. Thank you.